Garrett. Welcome to another edition of The Last Negroes at Harvard. There were 18 of us in the Harvard College class of 1963. We were born in the 1940s and are now 80 years old. In 1959, we were the largest number of blacks ever admitted to Harvard. We entered Harvard as Negroes, but graduated as blacks and African Americans. Our guest is David Fischer. He is University Professor and Warren Professor of History at Brandeis University. His new book is titled African Founders: How Enslaved People Expanded American Ideals. The book explores the little-known history of how enslaved people from different regions of Africa interacted with colonists of European origins to create new regional cultures in the colonial United States. I'm joined by 12 of my Harvard classmates. Liz.
Hi, I'm a member of the same class at Harvard as Kent, and I live in Tacoma Park, Maryland, just outside of DC.
Taverna Park, yes, we know it well. I'm a Marylander, born and bred there.
Oh, okay. I'm not a native. I'm from California. And one of my interests is that I am a direct descendant of enslavers and am very interested in pursuing that understanding and making links with people who were descendants of people that were enslaved by my family. Also, I've got COVID, and so if I either A, don't talk, or B, leave the Zoom, that's why.
Okay, get better, right. Spencer.
Yes, hello everyone. Spencer from Florida, where it's a little cloudy today, but quite nice prospects. And I am a member of the class of 61, and I am concentrating for the last 40 years in two elements. One is oppressed economic development, and the other one is sustainable development, the crisis.
Okay. Peter.
Peter Delisavoy. I live up in northern New Hampshire in the White Mountains, and I'm an editor and writer, and I'm just looking forward very much to Dr. Fischer's fascinating sounding topic.
Okay, Bill.
Yeah, Bill Collins, class of 63. Was a sailor. I had lighthouses on my shirt. I used to sail sailboats. No, not very big sailboats, small sailboats. Then I was in the Navy 20 years, driving big ships around the ocean. And then worked for Westinghouse for a while. And now I've ended up in South Carolina because of work at the Savannah River site, from which I am now retired. The Savannah River site made plutonium and tritium for hydrogen bombs. Doesn't do that anymore, but cleaning up the waste now.
Okay, great. Alden.
Alden Briscoe, grew up in New England, but live in San Mateo, California, just south of San Francisco. And my wife and I run a consulting firm for nonprofits on fundraising.
Okay, Hamp.
Class of 63 from New York and Boston. I've been living in Nashville since 1978. I try to bring together the personal and the political. I'm a still practicing clinical psychologist, and I get surprised at what new layers of racism I discover often, including one. What really shocked me on the write-up for today, David, was that how much African influences shaped us in our early years, and I was very aware how much our culture is white and black in recent years, but the idea that it was started way back 200, 300 years ago shocked me.
Okay, John.
Well, hi, John Woodford here in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I worked for the university, editing a publication for a number of years. And before that, I was in newspapers and magazine journalism.
Okay, David Allen.
Also class of 63 out in Concord, Mass, where you brought us Albion Seed some years ago when Barbara Powell, my partner, was the director of the library. So looking forward to see you're taking this next steps. My own life, I like to say, has been a sampler. Startups for the first decade, academic life in Cambridge, schools we know all too well for the middle part, and then recent decades activism, both globally and very locally here. Very much looking forward. Thanks for being here.
Okay, George Jones.
George Jones, again, class of 63. As Bill pointed out, the scene behind me is from southwestern Ontario. I'm not there now, I'm in Ann Arbor like John, but I do hope to be there this time next week.
All right. John Husky. John, how are you?
I'm fine. In Bloomington, Indiana, retired professor of African American and African diaspora studies, writer. I have long been interested in the genesis and formation of America with its encounter with people of African descent.
Okay, Jeff.
Hi, Jeff Fox, originally from Chicago, also class Harvard 63, long time living and working in Latin America and writing about Latin America and Latinos, now writing fiction, living in Spain.
Okay, Marcy.
Living and working in New York City. I was the information center for the successful battle to get billions of dollars reallocated from the Westway Highway and Hudson River Development boondoggle to mass transit. And I've been working ever since to counter the rewriting of history by the losers to support bad Westway type policies and public spending priorities today.
Okay, and Professor, welcome. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
And so tell us about your book and tell us about your life.
Well, let me say quickly that this follows it's a companion volume to a book that has already been mentioned here just a moment ago, Albion Seed, which was about migrations of different groups of English-speaking settlers who came from different parts of Britain and settled in different regions of different parts of the United States, and I think had played a major role in shaping the regions. I won't go into great detail, just let me say very quickly, it was East Anglia, the east of England to New England. It was from the south of England and the west of England to Virginia. It was from the north of England and some of London to the Delaware Valley, to Pennsylvania, New Jersey. And then it was from the borderlands of North Britain, both Scotland and the north of England and parts of Ireland. They moved to what they called the American backcountry. And Frederick Jackson Turner persuaded us to call the frontier. And they did everything differently in terms of their purposes, their values, all Protestants, all sharing some British culture together, but with very, very different results. And then it was a similar approach here to African groups coming to America. Again, it was a more diverse pattern, went on over a longer period, and came from at least 9 regions in Africa. I won't go into great detail about all of them. I think it's laid out very clearly in the architecture of the book. And in each case, we get different groups of Africans who became leaders in America. And I think it was that diversity that was of great importance, as well as the culture of Africa itself. Now, I should also say that my wife and my wife Judy is a botanist, a biologist at Harvard and MIT. And we're both in our late 80s now, and have been traveling together on all of our various enterprises. And she's very much of a collaborator in this project. Now, maybe I should shut up at that point. I tend to talk on after many years in the classroom, I talk for about 50 minutes on any subject. I think maybe I should subside and invite questions, comments. I'd like to take all of this anywhere you all want to go. So I'll take my cues from your questions.
Okay,
I just
Ham.
want to say I really appreciate your listening. All my professor friends are impossible to be on the other end of, and they won't shut up.
I'm barely hearing you.
Thank you for being willing to listen.
Thank you.
I think what we all want to know is what were the big differences as to the big contrasts of Africans from one region rather as distinct from those from another region, and if you can give some examples of of the consequences in the United States.
Yes. Well, I think we began. The book begins with a movement to New England, and these were Africans who came from West Africa. They were mostly people who shared cultures that are African scholars call Akan, A-K-A-N, cultures in much of the coastal West Africa, and they came to New England, and I thought their numbers were not large. But they had a strong sense of who they were. I think you can say they came from the Côte d'Ivoire. I think the largest concentration of them came from Ghana, as we call it today, reaching into the western parts of Nigeria. And you'll see accounts in some detail in my book with this regional pattern that I thought was exceptionally strong. And I should say my wife and I spent a fair amount of time on that stretch of the African coast, traveling with our own translators and escorts. Trying to get into villages, communities throughout that region. And that's the way we went about making inquiries here. And these people were very quick to challenge in bondage that they were put to in New England, and they also were quick to demand. They were quick to perceive possibilities in the New England culture, and instantly began to seek their own freedom. They obtained it in various ways in small numbers. And then by the time of the American Revolution, they were beginning to demand the right to vote and rights of full participation in America. And what they did was to enlarge the values of New England. I think they greatly broadened the culture of New England by that sort of challenge. And I thought that that culture was very interesting. We found something different in New Netherlands in the 17th century, in which Dutch traders were dealing mainly with people who came from Angola at the beginning. It changed. We have increasing amount sources for estimating the composition, the regional composition of African trade in America. The slave database now is enormous, and gives us very strong data for now many thousands of slave voyages. That's the basis of that's the quantitative basis of my work in all of these regions. But these Angolan slaves were slaves often who were of a highly developed economic culture on the coast of Angola, and they came to America with many skills of in trading and that sort of thing, a long experience of that. When they got into New Netherlands, they instantly began a process of bargaining with their Dutch masters. They realized that their Dutch masters, who were highly commercialized, who were mainly interested in profits, and they offered various inducements to their masters of things that ways in which masters could gain in some ways by extending individual rights to some of the, and so there was a process of bargaining that went on between these Angolan slaves and their Dutch masters, and they worked out arrangements for beginning to pry open some possibilities of living with some degree of choice and freedom within slavery by offering inducements, which I describe in some detail in that section. And in that process, they created a much more sort of a commercialized world in which Africans slowly began to creep ahead there. It was I won't go into great detail about the other regions. It was different in each region, but always it was a different group of Africans. They had some. I should also add that slaves came to America in every region, each region, from every part of the slave coast of Africa, as I would call it, from the bulge of West Africa down to southern Angola. And all of those regions, slaves appeared in each of the American regions. But the concentrations were very different from one to another. And it was those concentrations that it allowed some of the local cultures to preserve a kind of cohesion, which I think existed in slavery. Much more so than I think people have appeared, until we get the full results of all of this incredible outpouring of quantitative data that we now have at that all of us have at our hands on our computers today.
John.
Well, what about
I'll stop at that point. I could go on for 50 minutes, and you don't want that to happen. John. So I will stop right there, then to follow your questions wherever you want to go.
What was the influence of the Islamic adherents among the slaves and those who were not?
Yeah, well, I thought that it was interesting to see that the proportions who were Islamic varied from one of these regional movements to another. I think it was particularly strong in some of the Mississippi Valley, Louisiana. There was more of a presence of Islamic slaves there. And there were other groups in parts of South Carolina in particular that I have written about. And they were people who really tried to preserve their religion in the face of Christianity, and did so with some success. They had to do it secretly, but they did it nonetheless. And we know all this from the testimony of slaves themselves, primarily, which is what I'm drawing from in the slave database. And so that I think that everywhere they went, the Africans created a kind of Afro-European culture in America, borrowing from the European cultures of their masters with Christianity, combining it with African religions, and also with Islamic Islamic group as well, to create what they did was to expand the diversity of America in all of these ways, and also to add a kind of spiritual intensity to what was going on there, which I think has been very important to American history.
Bill.
Yes, I just wanted to go back to the English-speaking immigrants. A brief comment. You said they were all Protestants. Well, of course, in Maryland, they were Catholics.
Yeah, that's right. There were, though the Catholics were a minority in Maryland, with some exceptions in St. Mary's and other parts of the state. But Protestants very quickly became a majority in Maryland.
Oh, indeed, yes.
Yes.
Which was changed, of course, in the mid 19th century.
Yes.
Spencer.
Yes, I'm just delighted with your work, David. You told my family story, by the way, right at the beginning. I come from a Kan people, Ashanti, Coromante, from Ghana, which was then the Gold Coast and the Ashanti Empire. And you're right, they did come to New England, and you're right, they were highly skilled and negotiated, like you mentioned, with the Angolans. So did the Akan. The Coromante were the rebel groups, and they had their own language. And most of the slave revolts around from the New World, all the way from Suriname to Panama, Jamaica, everywhere, were often organized by the Akan, by the Coromante Ashanti. The New England person that you mentioned that they got involved, you may have been mentioning some people that I know very well, because they got the first right to vote. They petitioned, they fought in the American Revolution.
Yes.
So I think we're talking about the same group. That's my answer, direct to cuffs. And they did shipping. They owned their own ships, sailed them all over the world. And so they were enterprising. You described it exactly. I mean, it's like a movie. So I think your work, I can't wait to get to it. It's got to be really fascinating. Thanks for that.
I think these were highly skilled. Many of the Africans who came to America were much more highly skilled, with a richer culture than we have perceived in them in earlier writings, and they were also economically more highly developed than we have thought. They, for example, had developed techniques for ironworking. Even for the creation of, even for making steel, which they had techniques for doing that were in some ways superior to some of the techniques in Europe at the time, and all of that was brought to America and put to work.
The triple iron that revolutionized energy in the U.S. Petroleum, before petroleum, was whale oil, and a iron worker slave from North Carolina, Lewis Temple, migrated to New Bedford and invented a new whaling harpoon that enriched New Bedford and made it the wealthiest city for about 5 years. or 10 years in America, and his statue is there, Lewis Temple. So you're right on. Wow.
Yes, and the more we look, the more we find of stories like that.
Yeah.
And it's not it's the diversity of those stories that strikes me as particularly important here. I think that what keeps us free in this country is our diversity. And I think all of this was profoundly important to the way this open society works today.
Hemp.
Yeah. David, I'm one way that I find myself at a loss to follow you is that I am so ignorant. When I try, I can visualize a map of Africa with the current nation states there. I cannot visualize Africa with the original cultures that were there like 300, 400 years ago. And I just feel very limited by that.
Yes, I think we all are, but I think we're learning. I think we're more and more work is being done on these African cultures and on what elements of them that were brought to America. So my book rests on a huge amount of research that keeps growing exponentially these days into all of these things, and a lot of it goes on very quietly in academia. Many of the people who are doing this are deep into the subject itself, and not engaged in some of the politics of academia. They're really trying to learn more about these groups, and are succeeding.
Is there a way that you could summarize like 3 or 4 of the major regions in Africa in 1600?
The 3 or 4 of the major regions in Africa? Yes. Well, I would say that I just was most recently talking about Angola, which would be one of the major regions, which would be most people would link that to what would be in some areas that would be associated with the Congo today. But in this culture, we find lots of evidence of a very rich commercial culture in Africa, with extreme conflicts within it. And in Angola, there were groups of Africans who invaded that region and were often involved in battling others who were in there. And these were rather the people who were not as highly developed in their economies and in their cultures as the people whom they attacked in Angola. But they were very powerful militarily, and they captured some of these other groups in Angola who were more highly developed in their culture and in their economics, and sold them into slavery to European slave traders. And these were the people who were in these Angolan groups were highly developed in, for example, in their economic lives in Africa. And when they came to New York, they instantly began to interact with their Dutch owners, using those skills to their advantage. And so we get 2 entrepreneurial groups in New Netherlands, and the result is the culture of Manhattan today, I think, that we know and some of us love today.
Liz.
Well, to paraphrase whichever wife of whichever president it was, what about the women?
Yes.
I'm very interested in what you and your wife have found in terms of influences that African women had in the US, in America. And, you know, they obviously had a huge influence. And I'm just
Oh, profoundly important, yes.
wondering what
And
you're
with
finding.
great strength, and many of the women that I write about, they're very strong women, I think, in almost every region that I've written about in African American women from early times, and they often take a kind of lead that way, and I think we've had more and more attention to them, but I think I would say that my leading example maybe would be Harriet Tubman, and I've written about her at great length. Who she escaped from the Chesapeake area to Virginia, and became a major figure in American history. And we can see the strength of her leadership as a case in point. And she was of Asante origins, that is in West Africa. She was raised in a warrior tradition in which women themselves were warriors as well. And she built that into she inherited all of that, and it became part of who she was, and struggling first for freedom for herself, then for others, leading movements in the 19th century. And we can see that going back to African roots, and to a style of strong presence and strong leadership for African women in Africa. And Harriet Tubman working very much within that in Maryland, and then moving to Pennsylvania when she fled to freedom, and then working there.
A brief follow-up. Are there examples that you can give from the 17th and 18th centuries?
There are not so many because our sources are not so rich. But wherever we look, we see, wherever we look, we find that these things were going on in every period and in every region in the same way.
George.
So what about language? Can you say a little bit about how African languages affect the way that we speak today?
Oh, do they ever? I think it's just, first of all, again, it's diversity. It's a diversity of African languages that then meets a diversity of European languages. I'm not a linguist myself, but it's clear that African speechways became African American speechways, and have entered very much into the, I think, the very texture of American speech. I think I think as American English became increasingly distinct from European English, we can see that the diversity of African languages, of the richness of sort of a range of expression in African speech, it passes into America. It's the same thing with music, in particular. I think as it is with language, and I think almost everybody would recognize the enormous gift of Africa to Africans to American music. And again, it's diversity. It happened in many different ways, and I try to tell those stories regionally in America. And it was the diversity that I think is the key to the creativity of American culture. The Africans were very good at learning languages. They were used to linguistic diversity in Africa. And many of them had a great diversity of African languages before they got to America. And they were able to deal with that very easily in America. And I think what they did was to acquire English or French or whatever without losing their African languages and preserving more of that in the way that they spoke to with one another. And we're getting more and more, the evidence for this comes in various ways. One way that it comes is from the work that began to happen in the 20th century with people interviewing African Americans and recording the interviews. And we have many of these records of African Americans speaking African American and often African dialects. These are in the Library of Congress.
Wow.
And they've been much used, and that evidence is being studied by language experts with more and more attention. That they've got all of these recordings that were made mostly in the 1930s. It was during the New Deal. That these were people very elderly. They were many of these were people who had been born in slavery, even as late as the 1920s and 30s. They were still alive, and they were interviewed. And we have all of that at the Library of Congress and other places as well. There was quite a lot of work that was done in Louisiana as well on the Francophone cultures the same way. And that's what my colleagues are learning, as I have been learning more at a distance, is that we're able to listen to African people who had been born in Africa in their late years, when they were in their 70s and 80s, recorded in the 20th century, and we can hear them speaking to us in the Library of Congress today. We can listen to their language. That's what this research is. This work is based on. So we have a kind of a primary a set of sources there that are very, very useful.
And David, is this basically new research or what? Is it?
Yeah, well, it's much of it's my work. I've been going to the archives mainly. That's where I did most of my work, is in the major archives. Much of it at the Library of Congress and but at most of the state historical societies throughout the country. But it also rests very heavily on the work of others and on databases. We have these huge African databases now that have been African American databases that are being put together, and so we're all using that as well. Mm-hmm. And all of this is increasingly available online. First of all, it was available on microfilm and various forms of that sort. Now it's online, and so I think more and more people have access to it, and I think more and more people are getting interested in it as well.
Mm-hmm. David Allen.
Initially, David, you pointed out the role of leadership from these Africans who were brought into this continent, and then you focused on the first example, a woman. Harriet Tubman. Striking, first of all, that it was a woman. Beyond that, I'm wondering, do you have examples that are favorites to you that we might not otherwise think of cases, leadership in development of culture across the US from the Africans who came here?
Yeah, well, there are so many. And in every region, I think there were different groups of leaders, and I don't know. I'm hard pressed to come up with a lot of specific examples, but let's see if I can recover a few. I talk about John Coranty in New England. And he was these were slaves who came from Anamabo, and Many of them were also slave traders, some of them, even as they themselves became enslaved and were sent. And this man had a son, John Caranti had a son named William Anna Cesaraku, and you'll find him on page 45 of my book. And he was called the Prince of Amamabu. He had quite a career. He was a slave in Barbados. Then his father, who was very powerful in Africa, learned what had happened to him. His father was an African leader in Africa, and he intervened with friends of his in London and bought his freedom, if you can believe that. He was celebrated as the Royal African, received by the English royal family. He became a very prominent figure in England in the mid 18th century. And you'll see his story laid out on page 46 in my book. And there are characters like this everywhere in every region. I was just astounded by the range and richness of all of this. And what I tried to do in my book was to bring these individual people to life again, 300 years later. Because in many cases, we have their own words, we have the accounts of people who knew them well. And so we have portraits of this family as well. And it's amazing how much of that material is turning up more all the time. The more we look, the more we find. I also don't want to romanticize slavery in any way. I think a major theme of my book, which doesn't need to be documented in great detail because I think it's abundantly evident, is the brutality of it all. And yet in the presence of that brutality, we see these extraordinary, the strength of this, of individual striving by Africans. And now, thanks to this African database that we have, we can reconstruct individual stories, which I've done in every region. There are a multitude of these individuals, and many other of my colleagues are finding the same sort of thing.
Jeff.
Very rich texture to all of this.
Jeff.
And it's the texture of American life today that it helped to create. And I think all this, to me, reinforces what I think is one of the most important perceptions about American history, which was Madison's idea that it's pluralism in America that makes us free. And this is diversity that's squared and cubed and compounded on itself. And I think that becomes a source of creativity. And also, I think the interesting paradox is that the more diverse it became, that diversity had the effect of creating a kind of stability. It made it more and more difficult for any one group but to dominate the whole system.
Until now.
And I think that's fundamental to this country that we live in today. And I think that I want to celebrate all of that. And so we get diversity compounded amongst, this is a story of African diversity, of European diversity, of American diversity, which is compounded by all of that. And I think that's what makes this country continue to thrive.
Something to defend.
Bill.
So,
Yeah, a couple of comments. First of all, in this diversity, which I agree with you completely, that it's extremely important and a core source of the great strength of this country. And yet today we have political movements to try and suppress it.
Yeah,
right.
In the teaching of history and in the political sphere and so on, which is just terrible. And of course, that's not new, I suppose. I mean, of course, the Ku Klux Klan was an expression of that before and so on. But I was wondering, you mentioned these databases. Are they accessible to us, and how do we find them? Or do you buy your book and look in your bibliography
to
find these databases you mentioned?
Well, you can begin to get access to them very easily online today. Nearly all of them are online, and the American slave databases are online today. So once you get into it, and I think it rapidly opens up and becomes very accessible to anyone who really wants to burrow into it. And we're getting more and more interest by Africans in their own individual past. African American genealogy is booming these days, and so we're seeing that as the Africans themselves, or African Americans themselves, are very active in all of this. And but these are these huge databases that I cite in my book, and or the quickest way in, and they're mostly accessible. Often you have to be able to get into them through an academic library. Gwendolyn Midlow Hall is herself African American in Louisiana, and has taken a lead in organizing the searches and helping other people to search themselves. And there are many other people who are working like that. She has been instrumental in building some of these databases and working with other scholars as well. And there are many other people like that all over the United States who are doing this work. And also most of the institutions in America that most of the major manuscript repositories are part of this, and have been deeply interested in African in African materials that they have, and African American materials, and they've strongly supported it as well. So there are lots of portals that people can use to enter into all of this online, or into all of almost any of the major historical societies, into the university libraries, the Library of Congress, as well as working online, which is now where most people, I think.
Did you come across, in terms of the strong women that came over, one struck me as being particularly seminal to America, the first woman the first African to be granted slavery officially free, and therefore saying slavery is illegal, was a woman named Ma Betts, and she was in Massachusetts, and she was a maid who sued her family, her slave owning family, and won. So there's a strong woman example that is is generally not known. And the other thing to Bill is that right down the road from you, if you row down that Savannah River, you'll come to some African-speaking, or the remnants of African-speaking people, the Geechee and the Gullah.
Oh, yes.
So go. You know about that.
Yes, I know about that. I've been to, what is it? Let me see. Hunting Island, I think, is a big.
Oh, all of them, St. Simon.
All those coastal islands.
Deco Island, and
yeah. And
one of my closest friends amongst my colleagues in history is Charles Joyner. He's now in his grave, but he worked operated out of a small university called Coastal Carolina College, which was not far from Myrtle Beach in South Carolina. And he was a great scholar, and he's written the major books on African cultures in South Carolina. And we spent a lot of time traveling with him, traveling in some places by boat to islands where there are African American communities who welcomed him, and he is himself Anglo-American in his origins, but he is fluent in Gullah and Gombo, and was well known and much loved by everybody in South Carolina. Not everybody in South Carolina, but by many people in South Carolina, and it was a pleasure to travel with him in many parts of the Low Country. and to go to African American churches on Sundays, to get into the cultures there, to listen to Gullah as it is still spoken today, and not often in ways that are so accessible unless you go there, and go there with somebody who is known there, and can so that people will trust an outsider and speak openly with them. And that's what we tried to do when we traveled in various parts of America, traveling with people who were Gullah speakers themselves in South Carolina. And we did similar things like that in Louisiana and other parts of the South as well.
Stepping back from our conversation today, I can't help being reminded that our multiculturalism, our multicultural society is often described as a great experiment, frankly, often held up as a great risk. A democracy cannot possibly happen. Whereas in fact, our conversation today you have brought out that it's precisely that which is where the strength lies.
Yes.
Because power must be distributed across groups instead of one taking dominance.
Yes, and I think it's important to it's important to not only to keep all of that alive, but to keep it growing, and it really is these days.
I think we're all very impressed by your work, and some of the details that you have revealed are just fascinating. And clearly it's been a life's work. And I'm just wondering how you got started. Was there some particular experience that sparked this and made you think, wow, I have to get into this. I'm going to pursue this research. Was there some early experience of yours that got you going?
Well, I think there were a fair number. I grew up in Maryland, mostly in the city of Baltimore. And my father became the superintendent of schools for Baltimore City. His name was John Fischer. He was an extraordinary man. And in his grave now. But then he went on to become the president of Columbia University for a brief time, Columbia University Teachers College. But he presided over a segregated school system in Baltimore. And then when Brown versus Board of Education came down, he led the process of integration. And he did it in a very thoughtful and careful way, but he also did it very quickly. And there was an enormous backlash. But it kept moving, and he has always been. He was a very important exemplar in my life. And then we also had African Americans working in my family. There was a woman named Flora Jackson. She was a tall African American woman. She was over 6 feet tall, and she worked first for my grandmother. Beginning in the 1930s or so. And then she kept on into the 1980s. And she worked for my mother. And then she worked for my wife, Judy. And then she looked after my children as well. And she had a presence in the lives of 5 generations in my family. She was also at the same time, she was a leader of the African American community in Baltimore. She was a church leader in her church in Baltimore, and she was a woman of great dignity, enormous strength, and she was always an example to me and to everybody else in the family, as a kind of presence in our lives. And I remember her when I was a very small child. And it continued even into the adult years. And there were many other people like that. I could multiply examples. But we had contact with many African Americans in Baltimore. as well as with leaders in the Baltimore community. And all of that shaped the world in which I grew up. My first serious piece of history was as a junior paper at Princeton, where I was an undergraduate, and it was about. I thought that Van Woodward, I thought, wrote a very powerful book called The Strange Career of Jim Crow. And I thought that he had missed something very important, which was about the long history before the period in which he mainly worked, was the late 19th century. And so my first serious piece of history that I wrote as a junior paper at Princeton was about African American history. It was the first round when I was, 16 years old at the time, 17 years old. And it grew from there.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. It's been really quite fascinating, and good luck on the book.
Well, thank you for your interest in it, and to be continued.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. That was University Professor and Warren Professor of History at Brandeis University, David Fischer. And that's it for this episode of The Last Negroes at Harvard. I'm Kent Garrett. You can hear more episodes on our podcast, which you can find on Apple Podcast and Spotify, or from wherever you get your podcast. Plus, you can read all about us in the book, The Last Negroes at Harvard.